for application, that is VBA in this case. We have C, we have C++, we have Java, we have MATLAB, we have Python, and we have so many others. So these are just some few examples of the list of languages we have out there. But then in this section, we will be focused on primarily VBA, Visual Basic for Application, and in SL. So it will be very centered on the VBA that is done or used in Microsoft Excel. In Microsoft Excel. So now, what are the importance of programming? So programming basically helps us to power technology. And also it boosts our problem solving skills, right? So say that if I have some very big complex tasks to do or to work on, and I divide that task into a list of codes or programs, it helps me to work on it better than me doing it bulk. And it also improves our critical thinking. So one way the programming does that is because if there is a code to run, it needs to be as effective as possible to return the right results that is expected of it. And any good programmer or coder knows that a code must be very effective. That is void of any potential bugs or anything, and to give you the right output. And not only that, it helps to also enhance our career opportunity. This current that is IT and technology. Those with the edge of programming. It helps to enhance automation. Let's say I have some list of things to do. I can write it as a VBA task, or let me say some few code lines in any programming language, and then cause it to run those tasks for me whilst I sit or I do some other tasks. So that's what it means, programming helping us to automate our tasks, and it empowers creativity. One way it does that is the use of softwares and websites and even games that most people have brought up via programming. So in this section, we'll dive a little deeper into Visual Basic for Application, that is also known as VBA. So now this VBA is the language used in SL to create custom functions, to automate tasks, and to interact with the actual SL environment. But before we dive into VBA, we will need the VBA IDE, the VBA IDE. And by default, the VBA IDE is activated in the actual SL environment. So if anybody wants to write some few lines of code in VBA, he or she needs to first activate that IDE in the SL environment and go into the IDE and then write those lines of code for that purpose it is intended for. So our first thing we will be doing is that we'll be going into how to activate our VBA IDE, So if we switch into our SL environment, but before that, so if we switch into our SL environment, but just before that, these are some few programs done in VBA. So if you look at this worksheet over here, it has some few information on it. So we have this as our polynomial of fourth order, s exponent 4 minus s cubed plus 2s squared minus 3s plus 2 equals 0. So if I want to solve this in SL, I can write any custom function that will help me to solve this faster. or use any other third-party software, which might be very difficult to have based on where I am or based on my need for the solution of the polynomial. So this is a customized VBA function to solve polynomials. So if I come to solver over here, I have my polynomial solver. So if I click on that, there is a pop-up that asks me to select my coefficient of the polynomials. And if I do that right, it's from the cell B3 that contains the first entry, that is the 1, up to the cell F3 that contains my last, that is our constant term 2. When I'm done with that, I click on the OK. It asks for my convergence tolerance. I'll leave it at 1.0 10 to the minus 8 as it is. And I'll select my output location. So since it is order 4, it is set to give us 4 values of the x variable, that is the unknown. So I want my output to be in the cell A11. So I just select the cell A11 and I'll hit OK. So if that is done right, so this solver gives us 4 values of the S, and all 4 values of the S are imaginary values.
Like
our first X value is minus 0.296.
it's just like
Yeah, hello.
Are you recording it?
So it gives us 4 values of the X. Okay. Please, can we hear me now? Is this better? Is this better? Hello, is this better? Hello. Hello, is this better now?
Yes, please.
Okay, that's good. So as I was saying, if we have our polynomial of order 4, as in this, I'll extract its coefficient in cells, that is in continuous cells, either on the same row or on the same column. That is, we have 1 in cell B3, minus 1, 2, minus 3, and 2. So if I want to solve this in SL via VBA, this is a customized function in SL. So if I want to solve it, I'll just come to solvers. I'll click on the polynomial solver. This dialog appears. I select my cells that contain the coefficients as continuous cells. So in this order, I'll click on OK for my next input. It will ask for my convergence tolerance. In this case, I'll set it to default. So I'll leave it as 1 times 10 power minus 8 or 1.0 e minus 8. I'll click on OK. It will ask for my output location. In this case, I want it just beneath my cell that contains the 1, right? So I hit on this and I click on OK. So if the code runs, it will give me all possible 4 values of the S variable. So all the 4 values of the S variable are complex values. So we have S1, that is our first X, minus 0.3296 minus so and so. So this is a customized function in VBA that's of polynomial functions. Now let's say I have this as my set of linear equations and I'm set to solve X, Y, and Z value. First thing to do is to extract my coefficient as a matrix. So in here, I call that matrix matrix A. And these are the entries of the constant of the coefficient matrix. 8 minus 1 minus 1, 1, 2 minus 3, 2 minus 1, and 4. The same for the constant vector B. So if I want to solve it, just the value of the X, Y, Z. Since it is in 3 unknowns, we will do some few things over there. So to ask for my matrix A, that is of coefficients, I'll select that. My vector B of constant, I'll select that. It asks of the method. So in here, there are 2 methods. There is a Gaussian elimination method and the actual worksheet matrix function method. So I'll use the Gaussian elimination method. And since there are 3 variables in there, I'll select 3 cells to house my results. 1 for X, 1 for Y, and 1 for Z. So let me select 3 cells. Just 3 cells. So cell C10 to cell E10 on the same row. So I click and so if I do that, I have this as my values of X, Y, and Z. So this is to show how customized function in VBA can be used to solve certain problems in the numerical methods. So let us go back to the VBA itself. So if I want to activate my VBA IDE, so I first come to my actual SL environment, and in there, I look for the tab name Developer tab. I look for Developer tab. I have that tab over here to be this. So those who don't have that tab, please follow the instructions. So you come to File. Those who don't have the Developer tab, you go to the File tab on your top left corner of the SL window. In the File tab, you look for options. That is mostly on the bottom left of the SL window. So bottom left is here. I have my options here. So this dialog will show. In the dialog, I'll look for Customize ribbon. And the Customize ribbon is the fourth from the bottom on your left. So that is this. I'll click on Customize ribbon. New interface opens. In the new interface, we have two list boxes, one on the left and one on the right. I go to the one on the right and I look for developer. So I look for developer. And in here, this is my developer box. So if it is unchecked, I will just check this box. If my box is unchecked, I will just check it. So if the box is checked, you just click on OK, and it will add to your SL tabs, SL worksheet tab. So if I come here, I see my developer tab over there. So if I want to activate or open or use my VBA IDE, I look for Visual Basic in the developer tab. So it is mostly on the left part of the tab. So I come in the tab, that is my developer tab, and I go to the left part, that is in the code group, this button, Visual Basic. So I click on the button and a new window opens. So I'll have to close what I was doing earlier. Yes, the previous one. Okay. So I'll close this. A minute, please. So if I want to activate or use my VBA IDE, I come to my developer tab as usual. I go to my left part of the developer tab, that is in the code group, and I click on Visual Basic. So if I do that, this new app opens. This app is the IDE of the VBA, and it is in every SL application, just that by default, it is not activated. By default, it is not activated. By default, it is not activated. So this is our VBA IDE. So in here, there are several features of the IDE. We will look at each and every one of them, and we will proceed from there. So that's how to activate, and in some few moments, we will be using it. So just keep it open. Just keep it open. Just keep it open. So we have our IDE, and we have activated our developer tab. So now in the IDE, we have several features of the IDE. So if you go into IDE, on the top left is the project window, or in some other tests, it will be project explorer. So the project window, in the project window, there are several objects of the SL application that will be in there. So what it does is, it just shows you those objects that are in your VBA workbook. So if there are about 10 sheets in the VBA workbook, it will show all the sheets in the VBA workbook. If we have some few objects called forms and models, if any of the forms or models are in your VBA workbook, it will show them in your project window. And at the bottom of the project window is the properties window. And what it does is, if I select any item in the project window or on our user form, it will show the list of information about the item. So if you go into our VBA IDE, we have over here our projects window. So in here we have the sheet 1, where mine is called ID, the sheet 2, sheet 3, right? So you have this objects in our project window. So if I want to see the information about the objects, that is in the properties window. So mine is in the next lane by the right of the project ribbon. So if I click on this information in the property window will change. The same as if I select sheet 2. So I can see more about my objects in the project window as I select and look at its properties in the property window. So next thing to look at is the main window. Now, every blank VBA ID has nothing in the main window, and it will appear as an ASH window with some information at the bottom. With some information at the bottom. With some information at the bottom. So if I want to add some few things to my main window, we will do that by going to the Insert tab. But before that, let us dive more into the features of the IDE. So every IDE has a menu bar, and then this menu bar is at the top of the IDE window. So at the top of the IDE window, there is this first bar called the menu bar, and that bar contains the file, the edits, the save as, and some other features of the VBA projects. Down of the menu bar is the toolbar. This toolbar actually contains some buttons that is used to run the code, that is used to break the code, or that is used to toggle between some few lines of the code. So we have the first bar as our menu bar, and under it is the toolbar. And as we spoke of earlier, we have the project explorer, or the project window, at the top left of our VBA environment. And this is used to view and manage our VBA projects, models, files, or user forms. And also we have the code window. So in the code window, you'll be writing some few lines of code over there and checking how those lines of code will affect our actual Excel worksheets. So the main goal of this section is to make us familiar with the VBA environment, and we will try some few things over there too. So we have another window called the immediate window. This window is used to run either the code or just a line of code. So let's say that I want to test to see if one particular line of code or some few lines of code will work in my actual VBA code. What I do is that if I don't want to run the whole code in there or that whole project, I will just set those few lines or that line, and I will check it in the immediate window. So if it works in the immediate window, then it will indeed work in our full projects. So that's it. That's what the immediate window is and can be used for. So, and we have the locals window. What this window does is it just shows you all the variables that are used in your VBA projects. So let's say if we have X variable to Z variable, so X, Y, Z variable, it will show you those variables, its value, and the type of variable it is. So it can either be numerical value or just a text value. So it will show you all those information about each and every variable in there. And we have the watch window. This window just monitors the variable values during code execution. So if I run the code, it will trace as those values change. Are we there? So let's proceed. So now, in some VBA environments, the immediate window, the watch window, and the local window do not show, like in mine. So in mine, I have my immediate window at the lower side of my VBA environment and the watch window at the bottom of the VBA environment. So if I just want to show those windows or use them, I can just come to the view button in my IDE and I will select immediate window. So it will appear in my main window like that. If I want to see the locals window, I'll select the locals window. It will also show at the bottom of the immediate window. But then for some IDE, it will show at the right side of the immediate window. So mine is at the lower side of the immediate window. For some, it will be displayed at the right side of the immediate window. If I want to also see my watches window or the watch window, I will select the watch window, and it will also show mine is by the side of the locals window. And as I said earlier, some to be at the right side of the immediate window. So we will be looking at all of those windows and the relevance they have in VBA. So now, what is the purpose of VBA coding? So every code is to give the user several information or data. And then if it comes to VBA, VBA works based on hierarchy. So if I want to use any value, I must first define that value, and then I will call that value from where I define the value. So I can only call from above and not from below. It works from the top coming to the bottom and not the other way around. So we will look at how several VBA codes work. And in VBA, we have objects. These objects are just tools in the actual SL environment. So as we have workbooks and worksheets in the SL, those worksheets and workbooks, the charts, our tables, those things are the objects in VBA. So if I want to change anything in any worksheet, I can work them in the VBA environment, and it will affect them in the actual SL environment. So the worksheets, workbook, tables, and charts are all objects in VBA that I can change and maybe manipulate, and it will reflect in my SL environment. So we have ranges also, we have charts, and so more. Now what the VBA does is it can interact with these objects by specifying those properties linked with the objects. So we have the value property that is for cells, and for cell ranges, we have the chart property. You have the chart property, you have the table property, and so on. That can be worked on in the VBA environment, and it will reflect in the actual SL environment. So let's say that I have some plenty data that I want to graph. I can write some few lines of code in the VBA environment by fetching those values in the worksheet, and it will give me all the plots I want to have from those data values, rather than doing them manually and step by step. So I can just run it one time and I'll obtain all my chart, all my data, all the results I want to get just by linking them with the right properties and the right methods. And we have events. So the events are the actions that are done on the objects. So now we will look at a very simple VBA statement and how it can be executed So just before that, we will talk about models and then user forms. So inside any VBA projects are models and user forms. Inside any VBA projects can be models and user forms. And those models and user form can be of they can be plenty or just one. So we can have at least one model or none in a user form, in a project, one form or none in a project, in a VBA project. So if I come to my VBA environment, in here, I have only the sheets. I have sheet 1, sheet 2, and sheet 3, and I have this workbook. So in here, I can say that there is no model or user form in my project. So if I want to add any model, any user form in my project, I'll come to the Insert tab in my VBA IDE. And in the Insert tab, I will click on that. And we have several things I can insert. We have our user form, we have model, and we have class model. In this example, we will look at only the model. And if time permits, the user form. So the class model can be quite interesting. So we will touch on that later on in the training. So if I click on model, but first, I would like to take off my immediate window, my locals window, and my watches window. Yes, just to keep this place blank. So if I click on insert button and I click on model, new file shows in our main window, right? So in this file, so if I lower this window, we have our model 1. So if I come to my project, at first it was just sheet 1, sheet 2, sheet 3, this workbook. And then we have new folder called models. And in the models, we have our model 1. So that means if I have the forms and the models, it will create new folders. So if I want to add a form, I can do it same by coming to my insert, and in this case, I will select user form. And so it will produce new objects in my main window. And in this case, I have this as my user form. So if I come back to the project window, I now have forms. And in the form, I have user form 1. In the models, I have model 1. So I'll just close the form. I'll just close the form. So in the models, there can be procedures in models. And the procedures are primarily either a sub procedure or a function procedure. For the function procedure, that is, it works in the same way as any inbuilt function in Excel. So I can write my own custom function in the VBA environment on the model, and I will use that function by calling the function in the actual Excel environment, and I'll use it over there. So that is how the VBA function works. So I'll first have to write some few lines of code for the function, put in a VBA statement in between the function name and the end function. We will look at it, and afterwards, we will use that function by calling it in the actual Excel environment. So every model can contain a sub and a function. So if I want to add a sub and a function, I come also to my insert button, but in this case, I should be in a model. So if I am in a model, as in case model 1, I am in model 1, as it is showing in this window. So in the model 1, I will come to insert and I'll add procedure. So new dialog pop up. On this dialog, it asks for my name and the type. In the type, we have the sub, the function, and the property. And we have scope. In the scope, we have public and private. So if I want to put in a sub, I'll just put in the name and then select the sub. But if I want to put in a function, I'll put my function name and I'll select function from here. And if I want to put in properties, I'll do same. I'll put in my property name and then I'll select property in this box, right? But now a sub, a function, and a property can be either a public or a private sub or property or function. So what is a public property, public sub, public function? So if you say a sub or a function or property is public, it means that if we have several modules in the project, so there can be about two or more modules in the project, right? So if I declare my sub to be public, it means that I can call that sub in any of the models I have created, in any of the models I have. So I can create that sub in this case in model 1. And if I have model 2, model 3 to model 5, I can call that sub from the model 1 and use it in model 2, use in model 3, and use in model 5. And use in model 5. And use in model 5. And then the same as the function. If I declare my function to be public function, I can call the function in any of the objects in the project. So if I put my function in the model 1, I can use it in model 2, model 3, model 4, model 5, in even sheet 1, sheet 2, sheet 3, this workbook. So if the thing is public, it can be called throughout our projects, right? But then if it is private, it can be used only in the model that it was created. So if I declare my sub to be private, I can use that sub only in the model 1. That is where it was housed. So it can only be used in that model. So if I declare my function in model 2 and I make it a private function, it can only be used in the model 2 and not in model 1 or any other model. Are we there? So in this example, we will create a sub and you make it a public sub, right? So we will call that sub example. So just example. So, and I'll click on OK. Now, what happens is that after I do that, I get two major lines with gap in there. In the first line, the public sub with the sub name, and my gap will follow, and I have the end sub. So every sub or procedure must have the end sub or the end procedure. So if it is a function, it will have the either public function, the function name, or private function, the function name, and then also an end function line just after the public function with the function name. If it is a property, it will have an end property at the property description. Are we there? So I'll just write some few things in here, and we will look at how it works, and we will proceed. So in VBA, we have this command called the message box. What it does is it is used to display information onto our actual lesson environment. So let's say I have this thing and I want to display it in my Excel via my VBA code. I will put that in a message box. So I will define it somewhere and I'll put it in a message box. And then I will call it from there by running that sub in which it was written. So in this sub, I declare my variable. Let's say I have A as a variable, right? So A as a variable. So let's say A is my variable. And I want that A to be equal to a value of 20. And I want to display the 20 in a message box in my actual SL environment if I run the sub. But then I think I'll have to take away this line. We will talk about it later in the session. So now I'll assign my A into my message box by typing, and the message box command is msg for message and box with. After typing this, I will click on the C, and now I have several groups of the message box. We have people of the message box. So in this message box, I'll just enter my A variable. So we have it as this. So if I run this sub, and if I want to run a sub, I'll just click on the run sub button in my toolbar, and it will run it and then show the output in my SL environment, in my natural SL environment. So if I click on the run button, okay, I left an equal sign just when I was assigning the A to 20. So equals 20. So if I click on the run button, you see it will show the message box in the actual SL environment. And I'll click on OK to just close it. So, but then if I want to add some few lines before it, I can also come here right after the gap, and I'll bring my quotation marks, and let's say I'll just use A is equal to, but then since the one in the code is different from the A value, I have to add it to the one in the code by adding an end command. So that is just the end sign on the keyboard to end. If I run this, it should show A is equal to 20. So we have it in the message box as displayed in the SL environment. A equals 20. A equals 20. So that's how the sub work. So just have to run a VBA statement in between the sub identifier, that is either public or private, and the sub name, and then also end all those statements with an end sub. And now the sub can have an input or an output. So if a sub has inputs, that means that in this bracket, there will be some values in there. So let's say I want to feed in the value of the A and the B in this sub. That means I'll have to type in, let's say, just after my first bracket, A, comma, then B. That means that if I want to use this sub, I must feed in the value of A and B, right? So now I'll declare my new variable and I'll call it C. Where I see that C is just the sum of A and B. So C is just the A plus my B. Sorry. So C is just the A plus my B. So this will give me my C value. And in here, I'll just change this to C. Now change my message box return to also C. But then since this sub has an input, I can't call it as I did for the one without input. Why? Because I'll have to feed in the value of A and B before I can call it. So if I want to call subs with input values, I have to put them in another sub and then use them. So if I want to use the sub example, I have to put that sub in a new sub, and I will call this example sub from my new sub which has no inputs. Because if the sub has inputs, I would have to put in the values of the input and then I'll get the results from the sub. So in this case, let's say I'll add my new procedure, which is a sub, and I'll call it test. I'll make it a public sub. Now I'll click on OK. So we have test as our sub. In this test, I will call my first sub, that's the example sub as this. So I will call it literal calling. So I'll just type my call and I'll type my sub name, so example. And in there, I'll feed in, let's say A of 2, B of 3. and I'll just close it. So if I run my subcode test, it should return the value of the subcode example. Are we there? Since my examples are as input values, so I can't use them as it was when there was no input. So now, how do we define a function? So if I want to define a function, it works in the same way as I did for the sub. So I come in the insert button, I click on procedure, and in this case, I'll select a function. And as I said, the function may be public or private. So I just want it to be a public function. So let's say I'll call this example 2. Now I'll click on OK. So it asks my public function with our function name and then an end function. So just like a sub, a function can have, a function may have or may not have an input value. So if I define this function as one with no input value, then let's say that I have this variable c, and that c is given as 5, right? Unlike sub, to end a function, line just before the end function must be the line for the function name. So if I want to return any value for my function, I have to assign that value to the function name. So what do I mean by that? So if I want to return value for the c, if I want to return the value for the c in this function, I have to assign the c to my function name, which is example 2. So I come to my example 2 here. I'll just copy that name, example 2, that variable, and I'll paste it just before my end function, and I'll assign my c value to the example 2. So my example 2 is equal to c. In this case, if the function runs, the value that will display from the function is going to be the value for the example 2. And that's how the functions in VBA work. The function name is used as the function's output. So the line, my last line just before my end function line must be for the variable of the function. That is my function name. My function name. So I just said that the VBA functions work like the actual Excel worksheet functions. So if I intend on using this function, I can't call it. I can't call it as I did for the VBA side. So I have to. So I have to I have to call that function in my actual VBA environment. So I have to call that function in my actual VBA environment. So our function name to be example 2. Well, our function name to be example 2. So if I want to call that function, I'll just come into my Excel environment and I'll type my function was example. So we have over here example 2. This function has no input. So I'll just bracket. So as you can see, it returns the value for the C. Return the value for the C. It returns a value for the C. But then, if my function has output, if my function has an input value, so let's say in this case, I have my E and my B, and let me add just the C. So, and I say that my D, right, that is a new variable. Like C, in this case. I want to return the value for the D. I'll assign the D to my function name. That is my last line just before the end function line. So I'll assign D to this line. So I'll just go back to my SL environment. And in this case, I'll type my function again, but now it has changed, right? So if I do that, an equal sign and example 2. So if I click on FS button over here, I have the A, B, and C as my function inputs. So I want my A to be 2, my B to be 3, and my C to be 4. So we have 9 as our return. So if I click on OK, I have 9 as my output of the function. So the VBA functions can only be used mostly in the worksheet or in another sub. So I can equally call this function in a sub, right? But then I can't call it on its own in our VBA environment. I can only call it in a sub or in my actual worksheet application. Okay. But the sub can be called alone in a sub, in a function, and then also not mostly in the SL environment. So let's proceed with what we were already talking about. So now, that is how the VBA sub statements and the function statements work. That's how they work. So moving forward, we have our simple function in here called the calculate sum function. And this function takes in 2 inputs. That is the x and the y. And the x in this case must be an integer, as shown in this place. The y must also be an integer. And the function must return an integer. So if, let's say, once I was defining my sub or my function, I forgot to bring either the public or the private identifier. If that happens, VBA will interpret this as either a public function or a public sub. So if I choose not to type public or private, it will assume that it is public. But then if I indeed type public, it will take it as public. If I indeed type private, it will take it as a private sub or a private function. So like this example here, there is no private or public identifier. So it will take this as a public function, right? So I can use this function in the worksheets, in my other models, in my user forms, in any place in my project window or my SL environment, even the same page. And one thing is that if I define my function as a private function, I cannot see it in my SL functions. So I can't call it as I did for the function example 2. If the function is a private function, it can't be used in the actual SL worksheet. That is, if it is identified as a private function. But if it's a public function, it can be used anywhere in the worksheet or in the VBA projects, right? So let's take a look at this. So if I have a VBA model, so in here, the VBA projects may contain models, forms, and worksheets, right? And the models do contain our procedures, which is either the subs or the functions. And as I said earlier, the sub and functions may be either a public sub, a private sub, public function, or a private function. And so as a property, either a public property or a private property. So that is how the model is, and that is how it works. So, and also, models or objects are grouped under the project using the procedures that set variables between our entities. So if I want to use any procedure in any project, I have to make it a public project. Sorry, a public procedure. Public procedure. Moving on. So This is how it appears to be. So now we have several approaches that can be used to program in VBA. So we have the SL macros approach, which primarily means recording actions that intend to generate codes to use those actions that is previously recorded in our SL environment. And we have one called procedural programming that involves writing codes in step-by-step approach with either the step or the procedures, and that will be used to perform certain tasks. We have a third procedure called object-oriented programming, OOP, and in this case, we use the class models with some certain objects to group our code to perform our distinct or very specific tasks. We have new approach called the event-driven programming, where we write codes that respond to the user interactions, such as button clicks and so on. And we have creating user forms. So this is what we did just after doing our first model, where we go to the insert button and we add a user form. So it involved creating custom interfaces to use and work in SL. Now, what are macros? So macros are basically short programs or recorded keystrokes that can be used and reused anytime as needed. So if, let's say, I want to perform a specific task in SL, I can use the macro to record that actions, and I'll just be calling that action via its the shortcut I did assign to that action, and it will do it for me. So without me doing that whole action ever again. So that is the macro. So you record some actions with your keyboard, and you call that action over and over again to do very similar, if not the same actions for you. So the macro don't basically record itself. We need to actually do that on our own. So what is the way to record macro? So there are two ways of doing that, either by using the keystroke recording or by manual typing of the VBA code. So that intent is like the subs. So if I type in a sub procedure, it's like me typing in my own private macro. So the macros can also be called as sub. Are we there? So I can either create them by typing them on my own or by recording them via my keystrokes. So from some few research and personal experience, it is best to record those that are quite simple to perform, so that there will be no need to spend time to write lines of code that may or may not disturb you, right? And now, if there is any VBA workbook that contains any code, the file extension changes from the default .xlsx to the file extension .xlsm. So as shown over here, we have .xlsm. This file extension is used for any worksheet file or any workbook file that contain any function, any sub, or any macro in there. If you fail to save it as this file extension, you will lose all the VBA coding that was done in the worksheets or in the workbook. In the worksheet or in the workbook. So recording macros. So we will look at some few ways to record a very simple macro. So how do we record a macro? So first thing to do is to note what you want to use it for. And then you go to the cell that you first work that same task in. Then you record that action as you do the task in that cell. After doing that task, you just stop at the recording and save it. That with the same name or with a different name. And you can call that saved macro or sub anytime, anywhere in the worksheet. So we have this small function over here where we convert from degree Fahrenheit to degree Celsius with our formula T is equal to TF minus 32 over 1.8. So if we have several TF values and we intend on changing those TF values to TC values, we will see how to record a macro. So first thing is I will copy this function somewhere and I'll use it in my actual Excel environment. So I'll copy the function, right? Yes. So if I come to my worksheet, so let's say I come to the sheet 4. So I've added a new sheet. So in this column, our column A, that is A cell 2, I'll just type in, let's say, my values in Fahrenheit. This are just my own values I am selecting for the Fahrenheit, and its corresponding values in Celsius, right? So let's say I choose 212 Fahrenheit, 200 Fahrenheit, 100 Fahrenheit, 90 Fahrenheit, 32 Fahrenheit, 0 Fahrenheit, and minus 40 Fahrenheit. And the goal is to find for its corresponding value in the Celsius, right? So I'm just intending on changing this 212 to Celsius out to my minus 40 to Celsius. So if I want to do that, I come into my first cell that I will put the Celsius value in. So I'll record that macro in the first cell, and I'll be calling that macro in the subsequent cells. So this is where I want to put that value in, that is this cell. So I now come to the view. This shouldn't be happening. So I come to the view. So in the view, I look for macros. That is on the far right side of the view tab. So in macros, but first I'll paste my function. Yes, we have it over here. So I'll still come back to my first cell that will contain the Celsius value. So in the view, I'll go to my far right for my macros. I'll click on the drop down and I will select record macro. So I will type in the cell B3, the formula that changes my 212 Fahrenheit to its corresponding Celsius value. So if I click on record macro, it will ask for which name I want to assign to the macro. So I'll just say I'll just say, let's say Fahrenheit. So just F to Celsius, F2C. And I will assign my control R as my shortcut key. So control R is my shortcut key. And this is not quite compulsory. So I can just leave it or write something in here. So let's say I'll just choose to write Fahrenheit to Celsius converter. Celsius converter macro. So and I'll click on OK. So now I will still be in that same cell B3. And in that cell B3, I will start by entering my function that changes from the TF to the TC. So I'll start by entering the equal sign. And I'll put my numerator in brackets. So brackets, my TF value with this cell, that is the cell B3, minus 32 over the 1.8 value. After I'm done, I will click enter. So now this short keystroke that took about 5 seconds has been recorded and converted to VBA codes, right? So after I'm done, I'll just click on this drop down once more, and I'll select stop macro, stop macro. So if I want to use that macro, that is the F to C, I'll use either by my shortcut, that is Control R, and I have it, or I'll come to the macro drop down, I'll click view macro, I'll select that macro. In here it is F to C, I'll click on run, and it will give me my corresponding value in Celsius for the other Fahrenheit value. I read there. So I can do the same for everything. Control R, Control R, Control R. So one can ask that, why use this way and not do the dragging through and getting all the cells filled? Yes, this is a very simple task to do, so fine. But then if it is something quite big and complicated, it's best to write it as a VBA code by recording the macro and just calling that macro in your worksheet application. So if I want to view that my macro, that is the F to C macro, I'll come once again into my view, come to the far right, look for macro, click on the drop down and click view macros. And in here, I'll select my F to C macro and I will click on edit. So if I click on edit, it takes me to my VBA IDE. So in here, I have my F to C macro as a sub. Now this sub, like the public or the private ID. So it just means that this is a public sub. So we have two lines of code just for what I did. This is the first line that keeps the function of the cell C4. And also, since I hit on the enter button, it moved to the cell B4. Sorry, this is in cell B3. So it just moved to the cell B4. So any action that on the worksheet will be recorded as long as I go to the view macros and click on the record macros. Any action that I do on the worksheet will be recorded as a VBA code. And in so doing, I can call this code into any cell, any worksheet I want in my Excel application. But then if this doesn't actually work very well for you, you can actually change some few lines of code in the sub and set it to your right taste. So in this case, I like to take out my last line just before the end sub. So if this line is removed, you have only one black line of code, right? So if I run, if I go back to my SL environment and I'm to remove all of these values, right? If I run that macro F to C with my shortcut Control R, that is Control R, it prints my insertions value at the Fahrenheit of 32 in the cell B7. If I do same for the cell B8, Control R, I have it over here, that is minus 17.778 for the 0 Fahrenheit scale, right? But then in this case, as I do that, it doesn't move back to the cell B4. It just stays in the cell in which I use my Control R. So if I would like it to move into the next cell after I call the macro, I have to add a new line of code after my black line. That is my actual code line. After this code line, if I want it to move into the next cell, right, I'll have to edit my sub, my macro, to fit that purpose, which we will do later. So every VBA code may or may not have comments. The comments are just some few lines of code that are in the subs or functions. So any lines that are colored green in the VBA statement or code, it's a comments code. And the comments code don't run. So if I look at my F to C sub, we have our F to C macro as colored green, our Fahrenheit to Celsius green, our keyboard shortcut is also green, except the active cell dot this, that is a black line. So all the line colored green won't run if the macro is called. The reason being that those lines are being suppressed. So if there's any VBA line or code that is preceded by an apostrophe, it just means that those lines are suppressed. Those lines are suppressed. So like in this case, this line through to this line are preceded by an apostrophe. So this line will not run. So if I want to cause this black line to also not run or not execute, I'll just bring my apostrophe over here, and it will change this black line to a green line. So if I come here, it is now also commented out. So if I call this macro, it won't give me any result or any return if I call it. So let's try that and see. So for my minus 40 Fahrenheit, if I type Control R, there's no return. Or if I come to my macros, view macros, I select my F2C macro and I click on run, there is still no return. So the thing is, if I want to suppress any line in VBA, I'll have to precede those lines with an apostrophe, and the VBA automatically take that line out of the execution. So I want this to work, so I'll just take off my apostrophe and have my actual code over here. So this is the VBA object. So it's the active cell. Now, if you come into our SL environment, we can see that if I select any cell, on that cell appears a border that is colored green. So if I come to my cell E1, there's a green border on the cell E1. If I come to F1, there's green border on the F1, F2 also green, and so on. So this just means that that cell is my selected cell. But then in VBA language, that cell is the active cell. So if I want to change anything to that cell or to put in anything in that cell, I can use the active cell command to put in values, to take out values, or to manipulate that cell to any value I want, right? But the active cell, being an object, has several properties that are assigned to it. So if I want to make any changes to our active cell, I must make sure that those changes are in the property range, because if not, I can't make that changes. So if I come to my VBA environment, in this same window, if I type active cell over here, active cell, and I bring a dot, right? It gives me list of the properties that are linked to my active cell object. So we have activate, we have add comments, we have add comment threaded, we have add indents, we have so many properties that I can manipulate on or with the active cell. So I can even look for the row of the active cell by looking for row. So you see we have row over here. So that will give us the row of my active cell. And in the same case, I can also check my column of the active cell, that is with the column, right? So if I intend on changing anything that pertains my active cell, I have to make sure that that thing is in the list of the active cells property. So we have check spelling, the clear, we have the clear comments, we have the clear content, clear format. We have several things that pertains to our active cell if I want to change it. But then in our black line in the macro, we have active cell dot formula R1C1. So what this does is it assigns this formula to the active cell. So if I am in any active cell, what it does is that if I'm in an active cell and I call this macro, it will assign this formula into the active cell. So it will appear like I'm the one typing in that formula in the active cell. That is if I call that macro in that active cell. So let's say this was originally done here, and now this is my active cell, right? So let's say I want to call this my my macro in this active cell. If I want to call it, if I want to call it in the active cell, I go to my view, I go to the view, I click on macro, and I click on view macros. I look for the F2C, and I click on run. In this case, it will not work. Why? We will look at that. So if I click on run, oh, if I click on run, it worked, but then it picked this value to be 0. This value is 0. So this value over here is 0, and that's why it gave me this as a response. So if let's say I put F over here, my value in the cell F2 will be inaccurate. Why am I saying that? If we come in our macro or our sub F2C, we have just after the equal sign another equal to in the quotes, right? We have RC into bracket -1 -32 on 1.8. What this RC -1 mean that it look for our active cell and it pick at the value in the cell that is on the left of the active cell. So if this was +1, it would have picked the one on the right of the active cell. If it is -2, it would have picked the one on the left of the active cell. +2 is the right of the active cell. So that's what it does. So in this case, if I want to get an actual value for this cell, then I first have to put in an actual value in a cell that is on its right. So let's say that I have this cell over here, 500 Fahrenheit, and I want its corresponding value in Celsius. I just come to my macro, view macros. I select my F2C macro name, and I click on run. So in this context, I have my value of the 500 Fahrenheit in Celsius to be 2600, sorry. So if I change this to +1, it will pick on the right of the active cell. If I change to +2, on the right of the right, +3 in that order, right of the right of the right, I will there. So I can make any changes that I want to my macro if I know how it works, like in this case. So let me just change it to +1 and let's see something. So I just put one over there. So if I put one over there, then let's say I have my 500 to be over here. And in this case, I want to use that macro. But then since it is on the right, I have to be on its left, right? So I call Control R. I have it over here, 260. So if that which is in the RC is positive, then I'll go to the right of the active cell. If it's negative, I'll go to the left of the active cell in that order. In that order. So moving forward. So now, what if I have values in Celsius and I want to change them to Fahrenheit? I can either use that same macro, but in this case, I'll just change the macro name and then change how the formula will appear to be. Or I can once again start from the recording stage and proceed to the final results. So we have looked through all of this. We have looked at this. We have looked at that. We have figured out how to edit a macro. So now let's say I want to convert from Celsius to Fahrenheit. So I'll just do this and then we will look at some few things and we will proceed God willing another time. So now this is my F2C macro. That is my Fahrenheit to Celsius. If I want from Celsius to Fahrenheit, I can either select this macro and change this formula in here, or I can start from first principle by recording all my keystroke or my key sets. So if I want to make changes to this, I just select this. I'll copy my code. I'll paste it over here. I'll change the F2C to C2, right? But then in this case, I think the function we're changing from negative to Fahrenheit is 1.8 times our Celsius value plus 32. So I'll have to bring my times 1.8 somewhere here. I have to make this a plus 32. So that means this portion will just become 1 or it will fall off. So I have this as my C to F converter. So now I can use this macro. But then in this case, since it wasn't done by default, I can't call it with any shortcut unless I actually go and assign 1 to it. So to use this macro from Celsius to Fahrenheit, I have this value in Celsius, 2600. I think I'll use these values. And I want its corresponding values in Fahrenheit. So Fahrenheit in this case. So I'll come into this cell, I'll come to macros, I'll click on view macros and I'll select C to F. So if I select this, I'm coming in a minute. So let me just make it -1. So since my Celsius values are on the right, I will change this back to -1, right? So if I come here, now one problem is that at times, if the macro in question was not recorded or done by the SL application, it becomes a little disturbing to call it from there. As we can see, it is not showing the run button over there. But if I want to use it, I can run it from here and click on this run. So let's say I come to my cell that I want my Fahrenheit value to be displayed in, and I go to my macro myself. And in this macro, I click on run. So if I click on run, it will put in a cell that Fahrenheit value. We have over here 212. So if I want the same thing to my Fahrenheit of this value of Celsius, I'll do the same thing over here. I click on run. So I'll go to my SL environment, it will display over here. I'll be on the same page. Or rather, I can choose to record all my keystrokes as I convert from Celsius to Fahrenheit, and I'll call them with my shortcuts, or I'll go to the macros options in the view macros and use it from there. Yeah. This should show. And just make some changes small to this. So cell to far. Let me see how that goes. I'll not save this. So if I come here, hopefully. So now we have our cell to far showing in the list of macros. If I click on run, it will give me my Fahrenheit value at 37.77 Celsius. If I want my Fahrenheit value at 32.22, I do the same thing over here. I click on select, I cell to far, run, and you have it over here. So that is one way to write macro and to edit a macro. So you look at this final example, and in this example, it says in thermodynamics, an isentropic compression is a compression that occurs under adiabatic or no heat loss in reversible conditions. And the formula to predict our pressure volume relationships for a gas undergoing this compression obeys the equation P times V exponent K is equal to C, where the P is pressure, V is volume, and K is the adiabatic constant, and C is the quantum of proportionality. So in here, both the K and the big C are all constants. And it says that our K is 1.4, and we are to write a macro that computes our volume of gas from a pressure starting from 100 kPa to 1000 kPa. And we should know that at a pressure of 100 kPa, our vein is 1 meter cube. So now we have we have 1 point for the P vein, and then we have K, since K is a fixed value, K is 1.4. So if I'm to find for the value of the volume at my changing pressures, I'll need the C, right? Since the K is a fixed value, I know that already. And as I change the pressure, I come to know my pressure. So I have to also find my C value and use that C, the K and the pressure to get my volume as I abbreviate that pressure values. So from our equation itself, the V exponent K is equal to C. Since we have P at 1 point and its corresponding vein, I can get my C with this P and vein and the K over here. Now, since the C is constant and the K is constant, at each point P vein, my C will also be constant. So if that be the case, with my pressure of 100 kpm and V of 1 m cubed and the K of 1.4, I can calculate for the value of the C. And with my known C and my constant K, as I vary pressure, I should be able to obtain my volume. So if you proceed in here, so if you sort it out right and make the vein our heading of the equation over here, V will just be our fraction C over P all to the power 1 over the K. So in this case, K is of a value 1.4. But then C in here is just a variable. And at the P vein and the K, we can get the actual value of C. So from the actual equation, P of 100, V of 1 m cubed, and a K of 1.4, I can compute my C with the P, V, and K value to be 100. So that's over here. So our P of 100, our V of 1, and our K of 1.4 give us a C of 100. So now this equation just changes. V is equal to our fraction 100 over P all to the power 1 over 1.4, right? So now my V is just in terms of the pressure. So if I know my pressure value, I can calculate for the volume at that pressure. So in the question, we have the P from 100 kPa to 1000 kPa, and we are asked to find for the corresponding pressures in this in this range of pressures. So I'll come into my SL environment, right? In my SL environment, so I'll add a new sheet over here. So let's say in this sheet, I have my K value to 1.4, and let's say I don't know my C value yet. So I'll have to calculate for the C value, and I'll use the C value. So as we saw earlier, if I want to calculate the C value, I have to use this equation to do that. So I'll just copy the equation somewhere. So this equation, and I'll paste it somewhere here. And I'll copy my volume equation in terms of the pressure. I'll paste that also somewhere. Okay. So I'll paste that also somewhere. So if I come here, so if I want to find for the value of the C, and I have my pressures changing from 100 to 1000, right? So if I have 100, let's say I want an increment of 100 each. So we have 100, 200, 300, 400. So I'll just select and then fill in like that to the 1000. And my first volume is just 1 m cubed. So with this pressure and volume and my known K, I can get my C. So it's given as the pressure, and just with the pressure times the volume. And it is this volume that is to the power. So pressure times the volume exponents 1 over the K. That is this value, and I close the bracket. So you have our C to be 100, right? So now this function will just change to V is equal to 100 over P all to the power 1 over 1.4, right? So if that's the case, now I want to find for the value of the vein at a pressure of 200, but then I'll save that my keystroke as a sub or a macro, and I'll call it in my Excel environment, and then use it for all the other pressure values, right? So if I want to do that, there are two ways. I can either in this function put in my actual K value as I type and my actual C value as I type the function in the cell for the second volume. Or I can reference my cells that contain the K value and the C values. But let us try one approach. So if I want to record my macro, I'll come to my view tab, I'll come to the far right of the view tab and click on the drop down under macros. I'll select record macro. So if I select this, it will ask me to select a macro name or enter a macro name. So I'll just call it ADI. So ADIE. And I'll assign my shortcut Control J. So I'll just enter in here a J. Now, this box cannot be a number. It can only be an alphabet. So Control J. And I'll just say that calculates isentropic pressure. So volume. So I just click on OK. So I will now enter this function in my cell B7. That is my second vein value. So I will start by entering an equal sign. My C is 100. My cell that contains the pressure is 200 exponents. So I'll put my 1/1.4 in a bracket such that it won't give me any wrong return. So 1/1.4. I'll close the bracket and I'll hit on enter. So after I'm done with this, I'll come back to my macros and I'll click on stop recording. So I have this as my macro. So now if I want to call this macro ADIE to get my volume at the pressure of 300 kPa, I will just use my shortcut, or I'll come to the macro button and click on view macros. I will select my macro in question, that is ADIE macro, and I'll click on run. So if I click on run, it will give me my volume at the pressure of 200 kPa. I can equally use the shortcut assigned to it to call the macro. So in that case, I'll just Control J. That was the shortcut assigned to the macro area. So Control J will give me my volume value at a pressure of 400 kPa. Control J for the volume at 500 kPa. Or I just go by our traditional approach, come to view macros, select the macro and click on run. So I can do so for all the other values in here. But then there is one issue. After it runs, it moves back to the cell B, the cell C8, that is this cell. So if, for an example, I'll solve for the volume at 900 kPa. So with my shortcut Control J, so my Control J, I have that volume, but then it moves back to the cell C8. That becomes my active cell. So if I want it to go to the next cell after I get my volume, I'll need to go into my actual macro and edit my last line. That is my line just before the end sub statement. So if I want to do that, I come to the view macros, I select that macro and I go to edit. So it will show me that macro. That in this case is this. So in the black line statement, our second black line is range of the CH.select. So this line means that after I run this black line, it will come to this line and then it will go back to the cell C8 and it will select that cell. So I don't want it to happen like that way. I want it to go to the next cell. That is, after I have my value for the volume, it should move on to the next cell. If that is to be possible, I have to take away my range of CH.select and put in a new line over there. So as we discussed before, if there is the green border on any cell, it just means that cell is the active cell. So if I come over here, my cell E8 is the active cell, it's over here, 8 names over here. My cell F8 8 is the active cell. So if I am here and I want it to move to the next cell, it is in the same column, but then it's on a different row. But what we can see is that both the active cell in the cell that I want to are in the same column, but then it's on a different row than the active cell. So what I'll do is that I'll come in here. Since I want it to enter into a new cell, I have to use the cell property or cell object in our SL environment or the VBA project. So I'll enter cells. And as we all know, every cell has a row and a column, right? So what is going to be my cell row? That is the next row after my active cell, right? So if I open this bracket, it will ask for my row index and the column index. So my row index should be the next cell after my active cell, right? So I'll use my other objects called active cell objects, and I'll select its property, that is the row. So active cell dash row. But then now I want the next row after the active cell. So I'll do active cell dash row plus 1. So this will move my row number to the next row after my active cell dot formula runs. I will there. So and I click on and I just press comma. And since it is in the same column as our active cell, I just use my active cell projects or objects dot column and I will close it. But since I am to select, I will select that cell, that is my new cell, by ending these cells as dot select. So if this line runs and it gets to this line, it will move to the next cell below our active cell in the same row. Are we there? So let us try that and see. So if I clear this once, previously it will go back to the cell C8, that is this. So if I come here, next my control J, it moves onto the control J, it goes to the cell C11. Control J, Control J, Control J, Control J. So in this case, we have actually changed our few lines of the recorded stroke to suit what we want. So that is why it is best to know how to edit any macro to suit your own preferences. So this is how it was. So it is just the cells into bracket active cell dot row plus 1, comma, active cell dot column, and all that argument dot select. So if we check it with the actual values in here, we have it to be 0.6095, 0.4562. I think we're on the same page. So macro is like a sub where it has a name and then an end sub statement. These are the comments. These are the lines that can actually run if you call the sub. Those black lines are the lines of code that will be run if the sub is called. And we have made changes to our macro to fit what we want. Yes. So that is all for macros and how to record the macros and also how to edit any macro to suit your preferences. Thank you very much. Please, is there any question? Is there any question? You can unmute yourself or you can test in the chat if there is any problems. You have about 5 minutes to to attend to every question you have. Maximum 10 minutes. Is there any questions?